Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. I do hope that you're enjoying this course so far. This is Grade 1, Lecture 5, and today's topic is going to be facing bets, calling bets. Can we call? Do we have to fold? We're going to leave raising mostly off the table for today and just really focus on understanding what I hope will prove to be one of the most useful metrics or thought process tools that you're ever going to discover, which is actually considering how much EV you need to call a bet as a percentage of the pot, or what the pot will become after you call. In essence, in order to get your bet back out of the pot and break even, you have to have a pot entitlement in EV that's equal to the percent pot that bet then becomes after you invest it. So let's introduce firstly our framework for facing bets in open action spots and see how this works. Whenever you face a bet, there's a certain amount of EV that you will need to get in order to break even by calling. This is EV, this is not equity, and we're talking about open action spots today, meaning situations in which if you call, you will not be ending the action for the rest of the hand. I.e., you may still face bets later, there may be implied odds, future fold equity, realizability issues with your equity, and lots of other stuff going on. One of the biggest pitfalls I see the grade 1 level student fall into and succumb to is indeed this idea that required equity is the thing they should be thinking about. Pre-river, it's really not, unless you're facing an all-in. Required EV, very different thing. Required pot share. When I use the term pot share, I'm talking about your entitlement expressed as a percentage of the pot. If you have a very good hand, you may be entitled to 300% pot due to the promise of what that hand can win in future. If you have a very bad hand, you may have way less EV than your equity due to realizability issues or something like that. So it's not the same as equity. Pot share means EV, but we can express it in a similar currency to that in which we'd express equity, which is as a percentage of the current pot or the pot after you make a call investment. So we can calculate required pot share. We can calculate this exactly because it's basically just a function of pot odds, and we have all of the data, the inputs to the equation of pot odds that allow us to make this calculation. Basically, we will simply ask what percentage of the new pot after you call, that's the pot that you create by calling, your investment is equal to. So if you have to call 1 unit into a pot of 4 units, then your required pot share is 20%, not 25%, because the pot will become 5 and your 1 unit will be 1/5 of that or 20% of that. So it's all about looking at what the pot will become, that final pot for now after you call, and asking what percentage of that is your investment, your call investment, because that's what you need to get back to break even. When you first begin this process, it can be quite difficult. You'll be wondering, well, how the hell am I meant to know what my required pot share actually is, or even if I can figure that out mathematically, what is my actual pot share? How do I know if I meet my required pot share? And the idea is that you don't actually calculate whether you have the required pot share, you estimate, because actual pot share, which is your hand's entitlement in EV, is not something you can know without a crystal ball. Unless you're a clairvoyant, it's incredibly difficult to know exactly what your opponent's range is and what they're doing on every single part of the game tree. Even if you did in principle have this information, that you knew exactly how your opponent played every single part of their range and every single permutation that could unfold thereafter, it would still be absurd to think that a human being would have the processing power to calculate the net result of all of those different branches of the tree. Poker is a set of possibilities that kind of sprawls outwards from the current node that you're on. So clearly this becomes an absolute labyrinth, and the amount of different possibilities of things that can occur in a hand of poker is way beyond anything that we could process, even if we did have perfect information. Of course we don't, because poker is a game of imperfect information. So actual pot share is not something you calculate. You don't sit there in a spot unless you're looking at a solver, and even if you are, that's only theoretical pot share. Your actual real life pot share, you cannot work it out. What you can do is estimate whether it's high enough to equal your required pot share or be greater. You might be asking, well, Pete, how can I do that? If you're telling me I can't calculate this value, there's no way I can know whether it's high enough for me to call a bet. This is actually incorrect. You can figure out whether it's likely to be high enough to call a bet in the same way that if I presented you with a very small wall, maybe it's a wall that's 20 centimeters high, you could probably tell me that you could jump over that wall without being able to tell me that the wall was 20 centimeters, because without measuring the wall, you're not going to know how high it is. You might say, it's way less than a meter, it's less than half a meter. I can jump probably up to about a meter. You might, I don't know what you can jump over. It depends on your current level of athletic ability and your high jump prowess. But in general, most of us would be able to clear a wall that is 10 or 20 centimeters high, depending on your level of ability. But whatever your level of ability, you'd know what that was. So to come back from this sports metaphor now and bring it back to poker, you can pretty easily know in many spots that calling is either positive or negative, even if you don't know your actual pot share by calling, because you do know your required pot share. You know how much of the pot you need to get back to break even to claw your bet back out of the pot, and therefore you don't actually need to know exactly what your actual pot share is, and you can't. So let's let go of the idea that we can be super calculators. We can't. So there are some factors we can look at to get good at estimating whether our actual pot share is high enough to meet or exceed our required pot share. And the first and by far the most important and meaningful factor with the biggest clout, numerically speaking, in driving this value over the target value is equity. Now you might be thinking, Pete, hold on, you said that equity wasn't important here. I thought it was all about EV. It is about EV. Just like when you bake a cake, you wouldn't think about yourself as eating flour. But nevertheless, flour is a major ingredient of the cake, and without the flour, you don't really have the cake, right? So it's like that. Without equity, you can't figure out your EV, even though EV is much more than just equity. Equity is an essential backbone ingredient of EV. What's also important, but to a lesser extent, is how realizable your equity is going to be. This is basically a factor that thinks about how often you'll end up folding later. For example, hands like flush draws that can pretty much always continue in one way or another on the flop or the turn are able to realize all of their equity. One reason why a flush draw can be entitled on the flop to as much as 90, 95 to 100% pot in EV, not equity, is that all of the equity is realizable and there are a ton of implied odds to boot. Future fold equity is also important. We've seen already in lecture 3 when we discussed bluffing that when you arrive on the river in a spot where you've called a bet and condensed your range and your opponent has then checked behind on the turn, unless the board comes in a very redeeming way for your opponent's range, that spot is usually massively favourable for the flop caller because they've shed all of their worst combos, but the better by polarizing and then checking has moved towards quite a capped and air heavy range. So future fold equity isn't just, oh, I can make him fold sometimes later, because you have to pay, right, to try and get that fold equity. You have to risk another bet. Poker is risk and reward. Nothing comes for free. So future fold equity is actually us saying, on many branches of this game tree, not only am I going to have fold equity later on in the hand, but I'm actually going to have more that I need to break even, and that then allows us to make a theoretically profitable bluff, which will almost always in practice also be profitable, sometimes even more so than theory, based on how underprotected checking ranges can be from humans compared with from solvers. And then we have implied odds, the kind of holy grail of why you can call things that don't look like you should be able to call. When you call a flop c-bet with a flush draw, clearly your payout is not just the pot. It would make absolutely no sense to say, oh, I'm just calling to win the pot here. I'll ignore all of the times I win enormous quantities of big blinds thereafter, so that would be very incomplete, and that's why we don't look at required equity when we're calling a flush draw on the flop. We don't say, okay, I need 33% equity to call this pot size bet. I've got a flush draw, I've got 40% equity, I can call. Actually, the realizability of your equity isn't as high as that, right? So it would actually be close if there were no implied odds, but because of implied odds, so you clearly never dream of folding a flush draw on the flop. That would be completely absurd. So think of equity as the major ingredient. It's like the flour in the cake, the main thing that bulks it out. It's the baseline for calling bets in open action spots, again with more action remaining in the hand after you call. That's what an open action spot is. And we need to adjust this for the other factors present in the game tree as well. Realizability, future fold equity, and implied odds to name the main ones. There could be some other minor factors here too. And of course all of these factors are subject to the usual influence of exploitative considerations. This is of course a theoretical course, and we ignore exploitative considerations for the most part, not because they're not important, but because our scope is limited to understanding the foundations and the mechanics of the game in this course. So we need to remember that raising for value or as a bluff or semi-bluff might also be a good idea. Even if we know that calling is plus EV, and we saw this in lecture 1, we don't settle necessarily for just any old profitable line. We may also be rejecting profitable lines from time to time because we can find an even more profitable alternative. Sometimes calling will be profitable, raising will be better, and therefore we should never call even though it would be winning lots. We're going to ignore raising for today, and I'm going to intentionally not include too many situations where raising would be the mandatory response. Instead, we're going to look at spots where calling is just basically fine and is the main alternative to folding. Our main aim today in this lecture is to get a really good feel for when we have the required pot share to call a bet and when we don't. When do we call? When do we fold? And this is based again on these 4 factors here, mainly equity and the other 3 minor factors. So we'll start today's lesson with a very common spot, one of the most common facing aggression spots in the entire game tree, Generally speaking, the most common spots in poker come at the beginning of the hand when you're still on the base or trunk of the tree, if you will, not the bizarre river spot where you got 3-bet having check raised somebody. That's not really of interest because it's too scarce to make a large impact on your bottom line. However, a spot like facing flop c-bet is super common, and not being able to handle this spot, not having a basic mechanical solid thought process in this situation is definitely like a big problem. So let's start with a word on position. I refer to position in this context, in the context of facing bets, as the overarching factor. It's kind of this thing that looms in the background and presides over all of the other factors, apart from equity, which is just totally standard and not to do with anything else, but things like future fold equity, implied odds, and realizability, these three minor factors have a lot to do with position. So in what sense does position impact so hard on these other factors? Well, realizability is better in position. This is clear because we have the ability to continue further into the hand due to being able to control whether or not bets go in on future streets. We do this to a greater extent in position, and therefore our realizability, particularly with unmade hands which need fold equity when they miss and implied odds when they hit, draws, i.e. could be pair draws, straight draws, flush draws, combination of all of them, is much better in position. So realizability is basically how far can you make it in the hand? How often do you have to throw a hand with lots of equity into the muck? If you have 16% equity and you fold it, that's still really bad, right? And it's not that you can avoid folding it. We're not saying never fold if you could have 16% equity against villain's hand. Against villain's range, your pot share in EV may just be too low for you to call a bet, and that in the process does mean squandering your outs. Maybe villain pots it on the turn and you only have about 15-16% equity with your hand against his range, and you just can't continue because realizability is bad, implied odds aren't great out of position, everything just sucks. And because you can't continue, your equity is therefore unrealizable from that point onwards. That means if you rewind to the flop and say that you had 30% equity on the flop, only 15% of that 30 was realizable on the branch where you end up folding the turn. Now, we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking, God, I always call here just to fold the turn. That's not what happens. Very often it does go check, check, and we get that favorable bluff opportunity on the river, that probe spot that we've been talking about so much. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes our opponent does bet the turn. So while we don't want to obsess over, like, we'll just end up folding here and be like really strong and negative about it and black and white, it's always a mistake to be too black and white in your poker thought process. Everything's a gradable spectrum of grays. But you also, by the same token, don't want to be too optimistic and just pretend that your equity is always fully realizable. In order for your equity to be really realizable, you want to have this sort of redraw nut potential, this kind of thing that allows you to continue further into the hand, not just have a flimsy pocket pair that can call and then not get the chance to hit a set on the river and will actually fold as the best hand lots of times. Another way that you can fail to realize your equity is if the equity of your hand is actually 40% against villain's hand, or 80% against villain's hand even, but because it's not high enough against his range you have to fold, and sometimes you're folding a hand that has a ton of equity against his hand and therefore quite a bit against his range. You get bluffed, right? Another thing that makes your realizability lower is when you will be mixing in some fold or pure folding your hand later when it's just a showdown value pair or something, and losing to bluffs, losing to hands that you beat. You can't avoid that. You can't soul read your opponent unless you're playing live or you're against a very unbalanced opponent. But yeah, it's a big part of it. It does affect realizability. Okay, future fold equity. So when we call a turn bet in position, again, thinking about this overarching factor, position, and its influence on our three minor factors of calling bets, when we call in position and villain checks his air on the river, we will have the chance to bluff. So if villain is bluffing with queen high or king high or something and then decides to give up and we've reached the river with a jack high straight draw, we will be able to bet and we will win that hand very often, and we will win every time the villain has queen high or king high because he'll fold, theoretically at least. So these spots are moreover favourable worlds, and therefore bluffing is quite a bit better than zero EV. This is really the crux of the issue. If I was making an argument that went as follows, there'd be something really wrong with my logic as a poker player. If I was saying, for instance, I'm going to call this flop bet because I'll be able to bluff the river and make him fold sometimes, that's not enough if I'm only getting the break-even amount of fold equity for a bluff on the river. That's actually not a profitable thing for me to do to bluff river, so therefore the future fold equity cannot impact the EV of my flop call because I'm actually losing just as much as I gain by bluffing the river. So when we talk about future fold equity, make no mistake guys, we are talking about spots in which the bluff is mandatory and profitable later on the branch where villain gives up the next street. We gain a range advantage when we call a flop bet and villain checks back the turn. we then use that range advantage to leverage more fold equity than our break-even point on the river. This is how the theory of the game works. A lot of people don't understand this, and they reach a really high level of poker where other aspects of their game are strong, but they still don't have this basic mechanic. And this is why I actually urge people to take grade 1, even if they're at a higher standard than that, because there will still be gaps, there will be cracks in the foundations of their thought process sometimes. So understanding that future fold equity is only important when it's a profitable bluff you're making later is kind of key, right? But this is usually the case when you call a bet, so you can usually assert this with quite a lot of certainty. Implied odds now. So when we call a turn bet in position, implied odds go up because we'll always have the chance to value bet the river. Just like we'll always have the chance to bluff the river in terms of future fold equity, we'll always have the chance to value bet the river when we think about implied odds and we actually get there. So on the branches where we hit the river and make a flush or a straight or two pair of trips or a set or whatever it is that we've drawn into, if we're out of position and we've called the turn, usually you guys will check there, right? You will check to your opponent, it will go check, check. Sometimes you will not be able to ensure that a bet goes in. This is fine for you when your opponent has air because he wasn't calling a bet anyway and he may bluff now. It's also fine for you when your opponent has a really good hand that he's going to value bet. But what you lose EV against is the sort of middle to top of your opponent's range that may check back and say, I've got enough value now, it's too thin for me to bet a third time or second time or whatever it may be. So with implied odds, we need to understand that we can always call bets more easily in position because we can ensure that a bet will go in against every part of villain's range on the river. Out of position, we don't get to do this, and river will go check, check more frequently. So position, what it does in essence is it helps us pick and choose our future investments with more control, and this in turn boosts the EV of calling a bet. If the branches that follow from an investment are more positive for you, then that investment is more likely to be a good one for your win rate and not a mistake. But position is not the only thing that affects how positive our calling factors are likely to be. There are other factors in play here, as we saw. And I would like us to improve our skills basically and get a better understanding of how to compute realizability, future fold equity, and implied odds, and how to adjust the raw equity picture based on these three factors now. So let's think about being out of position here. Let's do a little exercise to warm up for this. Which option would you choose here as the big blind with this hand in this spot? Let's leave raising off of the table for now. You can either call in green or fold in blue. The big blind, that's you, 10-9 of hearts, you check to the button raiser, he c-bets 33% pot. We've not put an R next to this, we're not assuming this player is betting everything on 886, although a lot of people do that, but for now let's just assume this is a GTO strategy of, I don't know what the c-bet frequency would be here, maybe like 60% for this sizing, something like that. And then we have the chance to call or fold. Of course, we could maybe consider raising here, but I want to ignore that. Just leave that off the table for now. This is not going to be a pure raise. It's not like you have to raise this hand. So I want you to ignore it and just choose between call and fold for now. Okay, hopefully you've done that. And I want you to write down as well a few of the factors that make this either profitable or unprofitable to continue. Okay. So first off, let's compute our equity. It's the flour of the cake, it's the main ingredient, so we want to start there and then modify it for our other factors that come into play in an open action spot, not an end of action spot. This is the former. So according to the solver, we have 33% equity in theory with this hand. Well, how can this be? You may have counted the outs of this hand and been like, okay, we can hit a 7, we can maybe hit a 10 or a 9. The 7 gives us 4 outs. Let's say the 10 and the 9 are live sometimes, so that's 6 divided by 2 is 3. So we have about 7 outs, that's only 14%. Well, the thing is, the 10 and the 9 are actually live quite a lot of the time here. And there are also some other rare occasions where you just like backdoor into a boat or something like that. And of course, 10 high has some equity by villain just having like 7 high sometimes or 10 high himself at this point. Now, a lot of that's not realizable. The equity of winning with 10 high at showdown against 7 high is clearly not a realizable thing. Would sooner bluff than showdown 10 high on this node after we call the flop bet. But it's important to state, nevertheless, that 33% equity here comes in the form of straight draws, pair draws, backdoor, nutted runouts, and things of this nature. So that's got nothing to do with fold equity. It's got nothing to do with making him fold a king high hand on the river. This is just a description of the equity and it's not the end of the picture. So let's progress further. Secondly, realizability of equity. So clearly, not all of this equity will be realizable if we call, since we will face a turn bet. And in theory, usually, taking a sort of mean of all the turn cards, the average of all the turn cards, you're going to be facing a double barrel when you call a small c-bet around 40 to 50% of the time. If your opponent has bet all of his range on the flop, you will face a c-bet less often on the turn, Your opponent will have a more merged range and will have to check back more condensed type hands. But when you face an already partially polarized c-bet like this one, you're going to be facing aggression almost half of the time on average on the turn. So that means that half of the time we will face a bet, and of that 50% of the time, many of those turn cards, most of them in fact, will be cards that we can't call on, like an ace, a king, a deuce, a three. Be very difficult for us to continue on bricks here to massive bets. We can probably throw in some raise sometimes, but we're going to have our EV reduced to 0 or near enough 0 on most turn cards here, unless the turn is a 10, a 9, a jack, a 7, of course. It's going to be pretty difficult to call again. But the good thing is that just because all of our equity isn't realizable, we don't want to fall down the slippery slope fallacy here and be like, okay, we can't realize all of our equity, so our hand is trash, let's fold the flop. That would be really overstating the importance of this single factor. What we just want to say is let's take our 33% equity with a pinch of salt. We don't need very much equity to call here. You guys should know that the required pot share is only 20%. Now that's not about equity, that's about EV. But we start with so much more equity than the required pot share that even if all of this isn't realizable, it's still pointing us in the direction that continuing here is quite likely to be good, right? And then future fold equity. In the branches of the tree where villain checks a turn, we do expect on this node in this configuration to have a profitable river bluff, since the world will become a favourable one for us after we condense our range by calling on the flop. Again, you gain a range advantage when you call a flop c-bet and villain checks back the turn. We wield that to harvest more fold equity than we need to break even by bluffing river, and therefore the river bluff is a profitable one, not just a break even one. Lots of bluffs in poker are sadly just break even. They just are what they are. It's the way it goes, you know. But in spots where you gain a range advantage, that's not the case, and that will work in our favor here. So we start with 33% baseline. Not all of it's realizable, so that dips a bit down to, I don't know, 22, 23. I'm making up numbers because I'm not a supercomputer with perfect information. I'm just a mere human, so this is the best I can do. Sorry, guys. You should have bought a course by that supercomputer solver. He's much better than me. And then we have implied odds. If we hit a straight, we're entitled to lots more. Oh, I should say, the future fold equity boosts it back up again, right? So if we went down to like 20% equity or something that's actually realizable here, the future fold equity adds a little bit more EV to the punch, and we end up actually crawling back up towards the mid to high 20s or something like that. Doing this very vaguely. It's not a science, it's an estimation game. Strong poker players estimate factors in a gradable spectrum-like way. They do not compute math or numbers. This is a complete fallacy. So if we hit a straight, we're entitled to loads more of the pot after we call. Loads more. Like the times that the turn is a 7, or the river is a 7, and we get to see it, it's kind of important that you're still around to see the 7 river, your EV is sky high. It's way more than the pot. In fact, it's probably 2 to 3 times the pot when you think about the amount of bets that go in when villain has a value hand. Don't fall into the trap of being like, he'll never pay you off on the 7, you've just made that up. That's not true. You can't just invent things for no reason. Stop it. He will pay you off on a 7 sometimes because he'll have trips, or he'll have an overpair, or he'll have a draw that bet calls the turn when you check raise, or he'll have a bluff and he'll bluff off 3 streets. People don't bluff. People love to come up with reasons why they can't invest money. They'll never bluff me if I get there. But then when the shoe's on the other foot, it's like, oh, they're probably just bluffing me here. People love to invent reasons against investment, right? They love to have fear, and they love to justify the fear that they feel. But here, the situation is actually quite a rosy one for 10-9. The wall is low. The required pot share overall here is not much. It's 20%. Our equity is 33. That goes down a bit due to realizability, dipping it downwards towards 20, let's say, I don't know. Future fold equity takes it back up. This is not a major factor, but on some of the branches where we whiff, we will get to make a profitable river bluff. Our implied odds are a major player here, even though the 7 is only 4 outs, because we're entitled to so much more of the pot than you could even think of on the 7, it still plays a major role. Imagine it this way. If the pot on the flop after we call here is something like 10 big blinds, which is just a normal size pot, let's say it's like 7, 8 big blinds actually, that's more apt. The 7 turn or river is rare, like we only hit this card 8, 9% of the time. I don't know, something like that on the turn and then again on the river. But the thing is, when we do, we may be getting 2 to 3x pots. We might actually be getting 20 big blinds back whenever that comes. Now if that's only a 10% shot, that's still 2 big blinds. That's absolutely huge in a pot that's only 7 or 8 big blinds. It's very relevant even if it doesn't happen very often. Another trap you could fall into is the fallacy that because something is rare that it's irrelevant. Rare things in poker are often extremely important. For instance, if you have a pocket pair on a flop like King, Queen, 5, big blind versus button, you're meant to call one c-bet, but only because you can hit a set. If you removed your ability to turn a river a set and win a giant pot, you would no longer be able to make that call. So a lot of things are actually dependent on a really rare permutation coming into fruition. That's quite interesting, right? So a required pot share here is 20%. That's how often we need to win. That's how many chips we need to get back is 20% of the pot that we'll create by calling. The theoretical pot share, if we call, is actually 32%. That means that the solver thinks that when we call here, our EV entitlement in chips is the equivalent to 32% of the new pot, which becomes a thing after we make that call. That means that we recoup our 20% pot investment, because that's how much it will be of the new pot, and also get back a further 12% of that new pot. Our profit is 12% of the new pot we create by calling. Okay, we're still not getting back our pre-flop investment. It's not that good, but beggars can't be choosers. You're meant to lose money out of the big blind, right? That's okay. So the EV of fold here is 0 BBs. If you don't know this, go back to lecture 1. The EV of fold is always 0 BBs because you're not losing any more money from point of decision. Sunken cost fallacy. Let's not think about the money we put in previously. It's not important. The EV of call is plus 1.1 big blind. That's what the 12% of the new pot equates to here. The 1.1 big blind that we actually profit by when we call here is a lot of money. It's not 110 BB per 100 simply because this hand doesn't come up 100 times in 100 hands. You see here this fallacy as well. Poker is full of fallacies, as you guys are probably picking up on by now. And one of my jobs as a theoretician is to actually teach students how to uninstall fallacies from their thought process, how to uninstall these logical traps before they install the right building blocks to actually think like a strong player. And one thing you hear people say sometimes is, oh, it's 110 BB per 100. They times both sides by 100 because it's obviously a minus 1.1 BB mistake here to fold because call is that much better than fold. And they then make an argument to appear and they're like, you're losing 110 big blinds per 100 hands. No, you're not. Because most of the time in 100 hands, you're just folding 8-3 off under the gun. How can the fact that you're folding 8-3 off under the gun affect your EV in this very situation? Okay, it's 8-8-6. Maybe we want to raise the 8-3 when we know it's 8-8-6, but we don't know that, right? So the point is, we don't want to multiply this by 100 and use scare tactics to tell people how much they're losing. We should just accept that losing 1.1 big blinds in a small pot is very bad. It's a big percentage of the pot, and it's a huge amount of money in the long term, given the commonness with which this spot arises. So this matters greatly, but it's not 110 BB per 100. That's wrong. I hope there's some people out here watching this that have learned that for the first time and are now going to stop saying that scare tactic times both sides by 100 thing, because it's garbage. So this is our EV. Clearly we can raise. I deliberately left this out of the equation, but you can raise. But again, don't get ahead of yourself, guys. Today's lesson is all about understanding the difference between calling and folding here, and understanding the factors that make calling so profitable here, so that you don't throw away 11 chips in a 5-10 game. This is the structure the solver is using. That's your EV, 11.07 chips. That's 1.107 big blinds. Leave raising for now. We will cover it, I promise you. Just don't worry about it for now. So this brings us to one of my favorite fallacies to debunk, which is the don't have the odds fallacy. We commit the don't have the odds fallacy when we look only at our equity in an open action spot, of course, and compare that to our target pot share. In an end of action spot, it'd be totally fine to only look at our equity, because equity and EV, they become kind of the same metric, right? So we must remember that target equity and target pot share are only the same thing in end of action spots, as we saw back in lecture 1. Here's an example of the don't have the odds fallacy in action. We can see how a student might make a mistake here by essentially ignoring the other factors: implied odds, realizability, future fold equity, and position, and only thinking about their equity. This is a big mistake pre-river. It's a huge, huge error. It's something you should never do. But some of the fallacies that I include in the Carrot Poker School, I include them because they're too prevalent for the level of a student than they should be. That's to say, people whose game is otherwise quite solid still sometimes fall victim to these very natural traps for the human being. So here big blind has king 10 of diamonds. He calls pre-flop against button. Same old story, single raise pots. We will talk about more 3-bet pots as we progress as well, and 4-bet pots in future grades. Big blind check calls the flop here with a king 10 of diamonds, which is totally fine. You have very good pair draws, backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, showdown value. What's not to like? You can certainly call this hand to be 33 and should never fold this hand, especially against real life people who just bet their range here. A lot of them do anyway. We check, we face a turn bet on the jack of diamonds, and the student makes a fold. What do you think about this fold, guys? Well, here's the student's reasoning. We need 30% to call, and we only have 9 diamonds and 3 kings to hit. You can have the 3 other kings plus the 9 diamonds that you don't have, and that gives us a rough equity of 24%. This is using the rule of 2, basically multiplying your outs by 2 on the turn and 4 on the flop to get a very rough idea of your equity. The rule of 2 is great. It's extremely reliable. It's not perfect, like down to the absolute decimal, but it's good enough. 24% equity isn't a bad estimate of what our equity is here, but it's not right because the students ignored all of the times that King 10 is just winning at showdown. Villain could just be bluffing here with 9-7 and then give up river, Queen 10, Queen 9 and just give up river, 10-9 and give up river. These hands aren't meant to just always bet river, right? Because it's not going to be a favourable world for the aggressor here. It's going to be neutral. So we do win with King High sometimes. You cannot forget that. It may not be a large amount of the time, but again, a small amount of the time can be the difference between profitable and not profitable in poker. But it's not just that. That's not the only reason why this thought process is very wrong. Here's how the student should have thought. We have close to our required pot share just in equity. So again, our required pot share here facing B75 is around 30%. And we have implied odds. And we have the chance of winning with King High. So this student isn't obsessing about the number of outs, assuming that they're always behind, assuming that they can't hit a 10 and win that way, making a load of bogus assumptions. This student's being more general about it, more rough, more sort of estimate-y about it, if that's an adjective. And he's also remembering to think about both implied odds and the times that King High is just already ahead and is going to remain ahead and get a free river showdown. That can happen. Not loads, but it can happen. It's enough. So basically, this is a correct thought process, and the EV loss of folding here is 1.39 BBs negative because calling is plus 1.39 BBs. 13.9 chips is 1.39 big blinds. Ignore the number at the end, it's not relevant. Remember, this is a 5-10 game. If you're looking at these numbers, you're like, Pete, these numbers don't make sense. It's a 5-10 game. It's telling you how many chips you'd win by calling. This is quite interesting, right? That this is actually a very winning call, and you can only reach this call by avoiding the don't have the odds fallacy. Look at this poor gentleman here, just racking stuff up in the calculator and being like, don't have the equity to call, must fold. It's bad times for him, right? He needs to learn, one, how to not balance a mug of coffee so precariously on top of books, but secondly, how to think about the other factors that are relevant for EV. All right, realizability of equity now by hand class, hand type. Realizability is not a massive factor, but it's enough of a factor that it can definitely be a deal breaker. It can be the difference between calling and not calling in many situations. Hands which rely on winning with very marginal showdown value and that lack redraw to powerful hands, these are the hands that are going to struggle to realize equity quite often because they're going to have to fold at some point down the line at a fair frequency of the time. Now, of course, we don't want to fall into the trap of being like, we always have to fold the turn. You don't always face a bet on the turn. So how can you always have to fold the turn, right? Avoid that. But yeah, we do have to fold a lot. But hands which combine showdown value, SDV, with improvability and or have outs to nutted hands are going to have way higher realizability by being able to continue further into the hand. Again, why does a flush draw have EV pot share of like 100% pot on the flop even though its equity is only 60%? Because that hand is able to realize equity well, harvest implied odds and do all of this stuff in a good way. The flush draw is also playing against your opponent's range. It's actually winning sometimes. That's why I didn't cite like 40%. I'm not just assuming that the only equity of a king high flush draw is its outs to hit a flush. Or a pair, it can also just win with king high. Again, back to 886, our token flop for today. I want you guys to do another exercise for me now. I'd like you to score the realizability of the following hands. If they call the flop c-bet, I'd like you to select either high, medium, or low, and then choose between call and fold for each of the hands we're about to reveal. But do remember, when you're doing this exercise, whether you call the flop c-bet is not just about the realizability. Sometimes when I teach a student a new trick or a new toy, a new factor to process, it becomes the be-all and end-all mistakenly of their thought process. Why did you fold the flop? Realizability is per. Yeah, but you've got pocket sevens. You have like 75% equity. Just call. Please just call. So this can happen. We have to be a bit careful on this front as well. Pause the video. You know what to do. Get involved. If you're not going to pause the video, probably not the best course for you. You know, there are other courses that will spoon feed you stuff. This course is about learning how to think. Definitely pause the video. Assuming you've done that or refuse to do it, I can't force you to. Here are the answers. So King Queen. What you should note about this hand is that very often it will just be king high on the turn, and that's not great in terms of realizability. However, if it ever hits a king or a queen, it will always make it all the way to showdown. There's no way this hand is being folded after it turns a king or a queen, unless the river is like an ace maybe. It's very rare to see how this hand could be folded by the river if it pairs the turn. Turn top pair is much better than flop top pair, because it's not expected to be in your range as often, and it's not in your opponent's range as often after he bets flop. Especially when it's a high card, they'll be checking back his king queen here and stuff like that, usually in theory. So this hand is mediocre, I would say, with respect to realizability. Yes, oftentimes we are just left with king queen, the two bad showdown value marginal cards that have just pair draw and nothing else, and have to fold to a turn bet, but oftentimes we do hit. And when we hit, we have a monstrously realizable hand. We have a hand that we can just always realize with fully. Queen Jack of Diamonds, this one is also mediocre. It's a bit less robust in terms of not having as much showdown value. However, the thing with Queen Jack is that it does also have a bigger assortment of backdoor draws. So you can hit more straight draws and you can hit more flush draws on the turn that allow you to actually continue again by calling or raising depending on the situation, villain sizing, etc, etc. Ace 4, this hand has very, very pitiful realizability. While this hand is winning, technically is ahead more often than Queen Jack of Diamonds is, it's much more of a fold on the flop than Queen Jack of Diamonds is, because the hand is just very bad at hitting a pair that will be strong enough to go all the way. The pair of fours may not even be able to make it all the way to the river and certain action sequences and bet sizes from your opponent, and this hand is just never drawing to anything particularly amazing. It's much, much better to have King Queen here than Ace 4. King Queen is a pure continue on this flop, Ace 4 is a fold. And that's because the pair draws with King Queen are just way better and allow you more implied odds and more realizability. Deuces, low realizability, but this is just a good hand. Folding a pair here would be kind of crazy, right? But we will have to fold turn a lot, that's why the realizability is low. The reason it's still a good call is we don't always face the turn bet, and the best thing about deuces is that you do not have to bluff the river. Having to bluff the river, even if it's a profitable bluff, is bad. We'd much rather check down for free, right, and risk nothing. Having to bluff incurs extra cost that checking down does not. So having showdown value is worth a lot, even where your hand is not that realizable, because when you do get to the river and you get to showdown, you don't have to risk another investment to bluff with the deuces. Not the case with the Queen Jack, right? 5-3, really bad realizability. This is an okay sort of like raise candidate in my opinion. I think you could definitely be raising hands like this, especially against people that bet their whole range on this flop, which is a lot of humans. And this is the only hand I'd say that has high realizability, because I just can't see us really folding pre-river with this hand very often. So this hand is going to not only make flush draws and straight draws that help us continue further, but just the pair of sixes on its own is enough to ensure some degree of realizability, and we're going to see the river practically every time here, unless the turn is like a king and villain bets like 1.5x pot, in which case our hand will become indifferent and maybe a fold, but other than that we can call turn profitably, therefore we can see river. So we're going to call the king queen, we're going to call that we may raise some of these hands. We're not talking about that today, so again, don't be sat there like, Pete, we're raising, surely we're raising Queen Jack. You can also call. Fold this one, it's terrible. Call this one. Don't call this one, technically, but raise, it could maybe be a thing, right? Against certain people in certain situations. And this one is just going to be a slam dunk call. Okay, good. Hope you enjoyed that, hope you got a lot out of it. Remember, it's just about realizability, that's the factor we're drilling there. Don't take that to be the be all and end all. Deuces has low realizability, it's still a call because the showdown value means you don't have to bluff river, it's a good thing. You just have too much equity to fold deuces. But in position is a very different beast altogether. When we're in position, all of our pot share factors are going to be a lot more positive, apart from equity, which is just what it is. It's just the same. It's predefined by your hand strength, your opponent's range, etc., the board. But have a look at the following two sims. Both have been run on the same flop of King Queen 4 Rainbow, and both have been run with a node lock in place that forces the solver on the button to bet 100% of its range. Now, big blind versus button, sorry, not on the button necessarily, it's actually big blind versus button and small blind versus big blind. So these are both single raise pots. The big blind's defense strategy is outlined here. We have raise in pink, green is call, and blue is fold. First off, we can see that when we're out of position, we're folding way more than the pot odds norm fold equity of 25%. We're folding 32%. However, in position, we're underfolding relative to that target, even though we're facing the same pot odds. The pot share requirement in EV is exactly the same in both cases, but the actual pot share percentage pot in EV is much higher in position because all of those factors are really good. That means that when you scan through these ranges, and I'll let you do this on your own time if you want to pause the video and have a deeper inspection of this, feel free to, but some very general cliff notes about this comparison just for now. Have a look at a hand like Jack 5 suited, Jack 6 suited, 10-6 suited. These hands in position are actually calling or raising every single time that they have a backdoor and only folding when they are spade. Out of position, these hands just do not have a positive route to investment, and they're having to fold. Their equity is basically completely unrealizable from this point onwards because of position, doing them such a disservice on the left but a service on the right. Also, have a look at some flimsy made hands like ace-9. Ace-9 offsuit is a pretty terrible hand, but because realizability in position is better, because implied odds is better, you might be like, what, have you lost your mind, Pete? Implied odds with ace-9? Yeah. If I hit an ace and he checks turn, I'm going to start value betting right off top pair. So there's a little bit of implieds there. You know, don't fall into the trap of being like, because it's not a nutted draw, it has no implied odds. It has some reverse implied odds too, but that's another story. So we want to be very aware of this difference. Do not treat these spots accidentally in the same way. Don't fall into the trap of thinking, oh, okay, I just have 2 low cards here in a back door. I don't have the odds, I fold. In position, there's a lot more going on than just equity, so please don't be considering the spot from a required equity standpoint only. Required EV is your metric, actual pot share in EV is what you're trying to estimate, and your equity is just the flour in the cake. It's a major ingredient. Just remember that, right? There's a lot going on here. Equity doesn't change when we move from in position to out of position, but the other factors do. That's how you can see that equity is just not a sufficient thing here to determine your decision. Very, very different, really insightful comparison. Pause, have a look at it, run your own comparisons between 2 sims in similar spots. You can get a lot out of this sort of exercise. Okay, on to future fold equity now. So a large part of why we're allowed to call flop c-bets with flimsy looking hands, like frail kind of marginal looking stuff like pair draws, backdoor draws and gutters, and there are all different kinds of gutters. There are nut shots. I quote a friend of mine who likes to use that expression, nut shot. And there are also just like bad gutters. There are mediocre gutters. But the reason we can call with all of these types of flimsy hand is that future fold equity also helps, right? Now, of course, there's equity, there's realizability, there's implied odds. I'd say future fold equity is possibly the second most irrelevant one. I'd say that probably realizability is the least relevant, and then future fold equity, and then say implied odds and equity are the bigger ones, but this is still a factor that matters. And in theory, when we call a button c-bet from the big blind, we know that there's a sizable amount of the time that our opponent does not bet the turn, and we also know that those are profitable bluffs for us on the river. So let's have a look at this. We have 10-9 of spades, we faced a B33, and this could easily be an R33. A range bet actually equates to a very similar thing. Because the GTO bet frequency on this flop, button versus big blind, is so high anyway, you may as well lock it to just bet every single time. It's going to be super close to that. Not going to matter what you lock here, basically, into your solvers. So check, face a bet, and call with 10-9. We could have raised, we saw that before, raising is fine. This time we elected to merely call, which is also fine. Onto a turn, we don't know the identity of the turn, it goes check check. And now we have a profitable river bluff opportunity on most runouts. Not just a bluff opportunity, but a profitable one. Even a card like a 9, a jack, these are going to be, okay, we get there on those cards, but these aren't going to be bad cards for our range per se, because we're going to call this flop with stuff that's related to the king and the queen, gut shots, draws, open enders, etc. We'll hit the kicker with our pair sometimes too. So when we call this flop c-bet, we expect to see a check on the turn around 60% of the time on average, depending on the turn card. This is very typical. Try and remember that the average turn c-better in GTO bets about 40%, 45% of the time. Less if they've range bet a flop that they shouldn't. When this happens, our range will be much stronger than villains, because we will have shed our worst hands, and he's bet many of his worst hands and then decided not to barrel a second time. So the kind of hand that our range gets really skewed towards is twofold here in button shoes. Firstly, betting flop and checking turn is very common with weak top pair, second pair, random showdown value. It's also very common with some total garbage as well. It's less common with things like gutters, although it still exists, open enders, although it still exists, and it's definitely less common with strong king X, and it's non-existent with 2 pair plus here. It's always bet turn. Ace king probably always bet a blank turn. Aces always bet a blank turn. Therefore, on the river, we will have a big range advantage. You need to remember this. Your EV, in fact, your pot share on the river here on this node after this action sequence as big blind is very often 70% of the pot with your range. When that's the case, you have 60, 70, 58, I don't know, something like this percent pot with your range. Villain is folding way more than your break-even point, and that's what allows you to bluff profitably whatever sizing you pick. And you may be sitting here thinking, what sizing do I pick? I don't know the sizing, so how can I? It doesn't matter. Just be quiet about sizing. As long as you bluff something that's not stupidly small, you can just get away with making loads of money. On a blank run out here, after you call the flop, it doesn't matter what your river sizing is. You will get more fold equity than you need for that sizing. The bigger you go, the more fold equity you get. but you don't just go out and buy the best car ever. I'm going to go car shopping. I'm going to get Aston Martin. I'm going to buy a Formula One car. I'm going to buy a helicopter. No, you're going to buy what the best deal is for your budget, right? So when you bet 1/3 pot in the river, your budget is low. You wouldn't expect to get a helicopter for $1,000. But you could get an okay car from like 2004 for $1,000, maybe. So it's all about risk and reward. It's all about expenditure and gain, right? So the higher your expenditure, the more often you win the pot. The lower your expenditure, the less often you win the pot. When your expenditure is 0, you never win the pot with air. That's a mistake in a spot where your range is getting more fold equity than the break-even point. So as long as you bet something like quarter pot to third pot plus here, in a vacuum, it doesn't matter how big you bet. Okay, there's balance considerations. Long term, you don't want to always be bluffing small when you have value bets that are bigger. And you don't want to always be bluffing big when you have value bets that are smaller. But you have a queen here in your range, you'd bet small with that. You have a king, you would be 75 with that. You have two pair, you have a straight, you have a boat, depending on the run out. I don't know what the run out is here, but you have B150s maybe as well. So you can bluff all of these sizes too. Roll a dice, roll an RNG, make it up. It doesn't really matter. But don't worry about sizing, just bluff. Future fold equity is very good here. So therefore, getting the chance to make these profitable river bluffs is a big part of what allows us to call the flop and lose money when villain barrels. That sucks. Calling the flop and then facing a bet and folding is not nice here, but that's okay. We don't need to worry about that so much because that's just one part of the game tree. Let's not obsess over it. Yes, our equity isn't fully realizable on the flop, but still it's a very profitable call, and one big reason for that is the future fold equity. If you said to me, you're no longer allowed to ever bet the river, you have to show down 10 high when you miss, I don't know if this would be a call anymore. It'd be much closer, right? Be very close. But don't get too carried away. Future fold equity is not a sufficient factor. You don't get to the spot with 7-8 of spades and just call for the sheer hell of it because you can bluff the river profitably. In theory, you actually can't anymore if you call 100% of your range on the flop, right? Because theory knows what you're doing and it's all transparent and blah, blah, blah. It's very boring. But the idea is that you can't just call a hand with dreadful equity and no implied odds just because you have future fold equity. Future fold equity is an ingredient in the cake. It's not as big an ingredient as the flour, but it's more like, I don't know, the icing. You could have a cake without icing sometimes you couldn't, depending on what kind of cake it is. It's a more minor ingredient, but it's still an important one. That's how you should think about all of these factors. And the reason I stress this is that poker players are very guilty, oftentimes, of getting swept away with one factor and just having tunnel vision and ignoring everything else. And it's not just poker players, it's humans. It's just that in poker you get punished for that a lot more, right? Okay, on to implied odds. So sometimes our equity percentage is a good bit below our required pot share in EV. Like, we have a lot of ground to make up from the other factors, let's put it that way. And the single most powerful factor that's not equity is implied odds. So when we don't have any future fold equity, because let's say we're out of position on the turn, we don't have a chance to bet the river, unless he bets, then we can raise, but, you know, that's that aside for now. We will have to check down the river and lose a lot of the time. And we have very little showdown value. You can sometimes still call with draws, even out of position, even when you can't bluff the river, because the implied odds are just so good and it's a high equity draw. You can't call like a low equity draw. Calling like a gutter with nothing else out of position to a B75 on the turn is not the thing. But when your draw gets really robust and you have pair draw, straight draw, okay, the pair draws to third pair, you might be like, that's never winning. It is when villain's just bluffing and gives up, then you win with a pair of jacks or tens, yeah? Okay, you don't be a value bet with that hand, but you can win against villain's bluffs that give up when you hit a jack or a 10. More importantly though, the implied odds here are absolutely huge. So when we face this bet, even out of position, it's going to be a mistake to fold here. And here's why. Our required pot share in this spot is 30%. Our hand only has 8 straight outs, that's 16%, and the speculative chance of hitting a jack or a 10, and sometimes surviving, not thriving, certainly. And although our jack high is winning sometimes versus 7-5, 8-7, jack 9, etc., hands like that, we will often fold the best hand on the river. I mean, villain will be bluffing a lot of the time he has 7 high on the river, let's face it, and we will not be able to call with jack high. So let's not claim too much pot share from winning with jack high. It will happen. He'll check back jack 9 on the river, will win. You'll be flabbergasted, but you won't remember it, but it's important. You will never remember that. You're not going to be like, guess what? I won with jack high the other day because a guy had jack 9. It's not an interesting hand, right? You're way more likely to moan about a time you got cooler than remember that. But you should remember that because it's part of your EV. But thanks to our really nice implied odds, this is the thing. Our hand is actually a huge blunder to fold in GTO speak here. On the rivers where it hits, it actually gets way more than 100% of the pot. This is its pot share in EV as a percentage of the pot that will be created upon calling turn on the river ace and on the river 9. On the river ace, we have 212.8% of the new pot in EV. That's huge. This is what justifies the turn call. Okay, again, you may want to raise the turn, right? But we're not talking about that today. On the 9, it's a bit less. Why? Why is it worth more on the ace? Pause the video, answer the question. 3, 2, 1. I'll assume you've done that. The answer is that on the ace, villain is doing more betting. The ace is a much better card for villain's range. Villain is value betting and bluffing more frequently, therefore, on the ace, so you get more money. When you have the nuts, the stronger your opponent's range, the more EV you get. Having a set big blind against under the gun is more valuable than having a set big blind against button, because your opponent's range is stronger in the former case. It's interesting, right? So calling here and raising are both fine, and they're both worth 1.42 big blinds. If you fold here because you know by now, guys, don't have the odds, you fail to understand how poker works. You've only thought about equity. I hope today's been insightful for fixing this in your thought process. Okay, let's do an exercise. We have a homework exercise to do as well that will take a bit more time, but let's do a shorter exercise for now. What do you guys think? Should we call or fold the following spots? Pause the video, have a go at all of them. 1 and 3, you are in position. 2 and 4, you are out of position. That's going to matter a little bit, right? I'll assume that you have unpaused now. Let's see how we do. So question 1, 10, 10, 7. King of diamonds turn, facing 2 bets, jack 9. Double gutter. Hopefully you recognize this as a double gut shot. An 8 or a queen will do it for you. You're in position, meaning future fold equity is high, realizability is good. There's only one card to come if you call. So you can't call the turn and then fail to see the river, unless you call the turn and then muck your hand before the river comes. That's a bad idea. Don't do that. So realizability is good. Future fold equity is also good because you will have the chance to bluff very profitably if villain checks the river. And you will have a lot of implied odds with a double gutter and a fair amount of equity. Absolute no-brainer call. Big mistake to fold. Folding will cost you 1.4 BBs in this occasion. 10-8, well, this one is maybe not quite as obvious, but in a wide range conflict like big blind versus button, you're still calling second pair on this turn. Just because the king came and you don't like it and it's devalued your hand considerably and you only have a bluff catcher now, that doesn't mean that you don't have a very good bluff catcher. Villain will rarely have 2 overcards to your 10 in such a wide range scrap. Therefore, his bluffs will be kind of dead against you a lot of the time, and this is just a nice hand to call with. You want to call again with 10-8 here, you block some value bets, boats, king 10, etc., and just have a robust high pair, so you want to call here. You want to fold a pair, fold pocket 3s, don't fold this, right? 8-6, this is the only one that's actually really a fold. Spoiler alert for number 4. The reason this is a fold is that even though we are in position, the draw is just a bit too bad. You can see here that calling would lose you a 5th of a big blind. Raising would be slightly worse. I think against certain people, this swings, and this becomes profitable. For example, if your opponent is folding the river way too often upon checking, if they are giving up the river instead of bluffing way too often, these sort of things can make it a call. But it's going to be a fold by default, and you shouldn't call here without a read or reason or something specific. And ace-jack is a very comfortable call at just over half a big blind profit. You might be thinking, what? How can this be a call? Well, the idea is that you actually have a very good pair draw, plus some very good showdown value, and you have a heart out, which means that you block, not an out for you, but you block your opponents out by having that ace of hearts. So if you hit an ace on the river, guess what, guys? It can't be the ace of hearts. So this is the best ace to have, because when you want to pair the river in a way that doesn't allow your opponent to have a flush, and your opponent can't hit a flush, and also the river be an ace at the same time when you have this card, because this is the only card that does both of those at once. So, most people, when they do this exercise, are kind of surprised at how liberally you can call bets. I'll let you guys into a secret. Humans overfold to bets, naturally. In most spots, fold equity is way higher in a normal micro-stakes or low-stakes game than it should be. This is because people don't understand where the EV of calling is derived from fully. They don't compare their actual pot share to their required pot share target. They just find negative reasons and fears and anxieties to fold. Be careful. Defend a bit more than it looks like you should, and you'll do better. You'll stop having that plummeting red line. One of the functions of grade 1 is to stabilize the very common issue of the plummeting red line in students that are of this skill level. So that's a huge aim for this course, and this lecture is one of the main kingpins in actually helping you to improve this part of your game. On to homework task 5. This is a weird homework task. It's not the normal structure hand review one. Instead, we have some questions for you guys to think about. I want you to have a go at all of these questions, all 4 of them. The 4th one is a hand, the 3rd one is a board. The first 2 are just sort of abstract questions. Read them, have a think, write down some answers. So let's do it. I'll assume you've unpaused. I'll assume you're ready. Question 1. Having a certain amount of future fold equity can be a necessary condition for calling a flop bet. We've seen this already, but it's rarely a sufficient one. What factors affect future fold equity in practice? Well, we know that position affects future fold equity, right? That should be the first thing that you write down in order of priority. Another thing that affects future fold equity is just the opponent type or the exploitative nature of the situation. Are you against someone who loves to barrel the next street? If you are, your future fold equity is lower because you won't get the chance to bluff as often. If you're against someone stationary who's going to just call you with ace high because some draws missed, then again the EV of calling this hand is going to go down. The implied odds will go up, but the EV of calling some flimsy draw or something is going to go down if you have like way less future fold equity and you usually miss, right? Although it will be balanced out a bit by implied odds going up. So remember that, that's a trade-off. Future fold equity and implied odds are sometimes inversely proportionate when it comes to the player type of your opponent. Anything else that would affect future fold equity? I don't know. Have a talk about it in the Discord group. You guys are all part of that. I mean, you can talk about these tasks on there too. Come up with any other ideas? Sure, go ahead, list them. It's not necessarily an exhaustive answer by me there. What's the difference between the equity of an 8-out draw on the turn and the EV of an 8-out draw on the turn? Which is normally higher and why? Well, realizability tends to be good on the turn because there's only one more card to come. So you do realize all of your equity if you can call. It may be the case that an 8-out draw is a fold against a massive sizing, in which case its EV is a lot lower than its equity, like its pot share is just not going to be enough. But then its equity is probably going to be quite low there as well. The benchmark for how much equity you need will be high, how much EV you need will be higher. So generally speaking though, the answer to this question is that the EV of a draw is higher as a percentage of the pot than its equity because of implied odds. This is the main idea. Obviously position affects this, other things affect this too, but this is going to be the key. Draws to nutted hands capture a lot of the pot on the branches where they actually hit the nuts later. That's the key point. Question 3 on 975 gives some examples of hands with good and bad realizability. So good realizability would be something like a pair plus a draw that can like always continue. 5, 6, 7, 8, pocket 8, something like that. It's going to see the river a lot. Even a hand like Jack 10 of spades has good realizability. It's going to be raising a lot, calling a lot, and then just hitting tons of turns and hitting stuff it can continue with. A hand with bad realizability would be something like ace 10 offsuit, which might look like a call but is dicey, or ace queen offsuit or something like that, king queen. Hands of this nature, pocket 3s is really bad. Pocket deuces, when there's 3 overcards to your pair, is really bad. You can get counterfeited by the board double pairing as well as the usual array of ways. And finally, question 4, you play the following hand and post it in a study group. Someone says your turn call is a mistake. Offensive stuff. So how do you defend your play here? They say that you didn't have the right price to call turn and you should have folded. They say that you needed 30% equity to call a B75 and that your straight draw only had 16%, so you should have folded. But clearly this is a call, and your call is good. Well done. Why is your call good? Because you have tons of implied odds. You can hit a 9 or an 8 and win, survive on the river sometimes as well. You're in position and you have a very profitable bluff on the branches where a small blind gives up the river. So overall, really good call. Hope you guys enjoyed that offbeat homework task. We'll get back to some more standard stuff in next class, and I will see you for the next lecture, lecture 6. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.